Welcome, everyone. And I know that presentations often begin with the polling of an audience. So by show of hands, how many of you do outstanding work? Raise your hand if you're really good at your job. Let's see those hands. Who's really good at their job? Okay, very good. How many of you feel, as a result of the work that you do, that you're making a difference in the lives of at least one human being, at least one person benefits from your work? And how many of you feel, as a result of the work that you do, that you deserve a $99,000 a year pay increase? Every hand goes up twice. Know that I know that the world cannot compensate you enough for the work that you do. So thank you for what you do. I'd like to begin our presentation with a story. A number of years ago, I was having a lunch with a colleague of mine, a friend of mine named Greg Risberg. And Greg Risberg started off as a fourth grade teacher. The backdrop of where he taught was public housing on the south side of the city of Chicago. He went from a fourth grade school teacher to becoming a social worker and then a professional speaker. So Greg told me that one day a man called him at midnight and woke him up and asked, "Are you the same Greg Risberg who taught fourth grade across the street from public housing 30 years ago?" And Greg said, "Yeah, that's me." He says, "I was in your fourth grade class. You were my teacher." He said, "I'm a decorated military man. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if I wouldn't wind up achieving the rank of a colon pound. I was just calling you to tell you that you really made a difference in my life." And Greg said, "What did I do?" He says, "Every Friday you would stop teaching. You would sit the whole class in a large circle, and you would have us to read the newspaper from cover to cover. And in reading the newspaper from cover to cover, what I learned was that there was more happening in the world than simply what was happening in public housing, so it made me curious about the world. I hurried up and graduated from high school, joined the military. I went around the world twice," he said. "But you did something that was more special than that." He said, "One day you invited the whole class on a special field trip. You invited the entire fourth grade class to your house. You asked everybody to bring a bag lunch to your house. I looked in my refrigerator that night and I saw that I had no food. When I made your house with no food, you went in your refrigerator and you fixed me a sandwich." He said, "Anyway, the reason I'm calling is because we still have a home in Chicago and I'll be coming home next month. And I wanted to invite you over to my house so I could fix you a sandwich." When he told me that story, it dawns on me that it took him 30 years to see the fruits of his labor. Your work is like that. You're like farmers who plant seeds, who may not see the fruits of your labor in the season that you plant the seed. Sometimes it takes many seasons to see the fruits of your labor. So I know that you do your work based upon faith. So again, thank you for what you do, and thank you for your having faith. I know as it pertains to recovery, I agree with Tonir Kane. As long as there's breath, there's hope. So let me meet you and let us know who you are. Would you find your chat feature? Would you put in chat what you do? That'll give me an indication of who I'm speaking with today. What do you do? Are you a counselor, case manager, recovery coach, executive director? What do you do? And Corey, you can let us know some of the responses.
Yes,
Thank
sir. We have regional manager, psychology intern, SUD counselor, senior equity specialist, re-entry coordinator, a project director, homeless outreach coordinator, supervisory intervention specialist, recovery coach, senior program implementation specialist, case managers with drug courts, AOD educator, and trauma-informed equity consultant.
Okay, so it sounds like, thank you, Corey, like we have a range. And by the time we're through, my goal is for all of you to be convinced that you ought to be a part of a healing force to promote recovery. So our title today of the presentation is The Healing Force, the entire African-American community as the recovery center. The concept of the healing force was created by Don Coyes, a member of the Mohican Nation, Native American living in Wisconsin. And he got into recovery, but then he felt a sense of pessimism because most of his tribe was still getting high. They were still drinking heavily, and the suicide rate was really high. So Don Coyes met with the elders, and he asked the elders, what will be the sign that it's time for Native Americans to achieve a great deal of recovery? As you know, Native Americans had the highest alcoholism rate in the world. And the elders told Don Coyes that a sign that Native Americans are ready to recover in big numbers is that a white buffalo will be born somewhere in the United States. Now, you know, most buffalo are black or brown, but there's the actual buffalo that the elders spoke of. Born in Janesville, Wisconsin, the same state where Don Coyers lived. So he started an organization called whitebison.org, based upon the birth of the white buffalo. And what they do is they mobilize Native American communities. They create healing forests to work together to promote recovery. And as we speak, there are tribes in the United States that are achieving 40, 50, 60, and 70% recovery rates through this mobilization, the healing forest. Don Coyers calls their movement the well-briety movement. Native Americans believe it's possible to be sober but not well. Do you believe it's possible for someone to be sober and not well? So I'm going to share with you a story. Don Coyers organized a 4,000-mile walk from California to Washington, D.C., to the Capitol building, sending the message that Native Americans can and do recover. And every step of the way between California to Washington, D.C., new tribes would join this walk. So visualize thousands of Native Americans walking for recovery. So here's the story. I met a young woman who told me that she joined that walk when she was in high school. She cut class that day and she joined the walk. And she says that she was withdrawing from methamphetamine and alcohol. She was going through withdrawal while she was walking from Colorado to DC, 1,000 miles. 1,000 miles she walked. She says while she was going through withdrawal, she felt like collapsing, but members of various tribes would hold her up. And on her way to DC, she learned to speak the language of her tribe. She learned songs from her tribe. By the time she got to DC, she was in recovery. Now she's in long-term recovery, one of the leaders of our recovery movement. So Don Coyers described the healing forest this way. Suppose you have 1,000 acres of trees that want to get well. If each sick tree leaves the forest and finds wellness, then they return to the forest. They get sick again from the infection of the rest of the trees. Let me say that again. Suppose you have 100 acres full of sick trees that want to get well. If each sick tree leaves the forest and finds wellness and then returns to the forest, they get sick again from the infection of the rest of the trees. Let me explain what I'm talking about. How many of you have ever known someone to go to residential treatment and get well and then go back home and get sick again? Have you known people to go to prison, start lifting weights, getting a good night's sleep, eating 3 meals a day, getting their GED, their associate's degree, they're well. And then they go home and they get sick again. The elders taught us that to treat the sick trees, you must treat the whole forest. You must create a healing forest. If not, the trees will just keep getting sick. The community forest is now filled with alcoholic trees, drug-addicted trees, trees with codependency, domestic violence trees, and trees with mental illness. The soil in which those trees are growing is missing the ceremony, the songs and the stories, the language, and the wisdom of the elders. So in creating a healing forest, what we believe, the gist of it is that the entire community becomes the recovery center, and the whole community works together to foster recovery. And it's really important to anchor that recovery in the national environment where clients live. Call that treatment behind walls. In other words, anybody can get well inside of a building called a treatment center. Where it really gets challenging is that when those that we serve go back home. Creating a healing forest involves the mobilization of the entire community to work together to foster and support recovery. Healing forests are anchored in the community. A healing forest, again, is like treatment without walls. Thank you, Corey. We can go to the next slide. Crisis was shifted a focus in the African-American community towards solely focusing on acute care treatment, like intensive outpatient or inpatient treatment or short-term residential treatment, towards creating healing forests anchored in the entire community. And we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So the first of those crises that led to a shift towards thinking about healing forests in African-American communities is the crack cocaine crisis of the 1980s. The specific year was 1986. Someone may need to mute themselves. So I want you to take a moment to think about where you were in 1986. 1986 was the year that crack cocaine replaced marijuana as the #1 street drug. How many remember that? You see, what happened was that in 1985, there was a stand-up comic named Richard Pryor, and he was running down Santa Monica Boulevard. He was in flames. He was burning up. He started rolling. What happened? Richard Pryor was freebasing cocaine. Whenever you freebase, ether is used, and ether is considered very flammable. So he caught fire. So in 1986, street scientists decided that there would be a safer way. There needed to be a safer way to use cocaine. So they took out the ether and they replaced it with baking soda. And that was the birth of crack. And why do they call crack crack? Anybody? Why do they call crack crack? Because when baking soda is heated, it makes a cracking sound. May 29th, 1986, I was giving my first speech ever. That same year crack was born. And someone knocked on the door. Is there Mark Sanders here? You have an urgent phone call, take it now. My mother was on the other end of the phone crying. And she told me that my dad had just died in a closet at work, and he was smoking a drug of his choice, cocaine. So my father was one of the first casualties after crack cocaine was born. About 2 weeks later, there was a basketball player named Len Bias. And Len Bias was considered the second coming of Michael Jordan. In fact, to this day, they still compare who was better, Michael Jordan or Len Bias. They say that Len Bias jumped so high, if he went in the air on a Monday, when he came down, it was Tuesday. He played for the University of Maryland. And he was drafted #1 by the Boston Celtics. And Len Bias was going to team with Larry Bird and Kevin McHale and 4 other Hall of Famers. And the night he was drafted by the Boston Celtics, #1, he went to a party and snorted some cocaine, had a heart attack, and he died. Remember that? And his death angered Congress. So Congress then, in June of 1986, intensified Richard Nixon's war on drugs, and the prison population ultimately increased from 400,000 incarcerated in 1985 to 1 million by 1995, to 2.5 million by 2005, doubled every decade or so, disproportionately African Americans. It went from like a person having a disease and illness to being seen as a criminal. There was increased child welfare involvement. We started using terms like crack baby. You remember the term crack baby? And when they started using the term crack baby, child welfare agencies all over the country started showing up at hospitals and taking away the babies of mothers who were addicted to crack cocaine. Do you remember that? All based upon stigma. No research. In fact, years later, we learned that alcohol does more damage overall to the onboard fetus than does cocaine. Cigarettes does more damage to the unborn fetus than does cocaine. You have not lived until you witnessed what I witnessed in 1991. There was a woman in Cook County Jail who was pregnant. Did you know that 1 out of 10 incarcerated women are pregnant? I'll take a second for you to think about what I just said. Across our country, 1 out of 10 women who are incarcerated are pregnant. So they took her from the county jail to the county hospital to deliver her baby. They shackled her arms to the back of the bed. They shackled her feet to the front of the bed. Corrections officers were in her room. Child welfare was in her room. When her baby was born, they took the baby and she went back to jail. At the same time, crack showed up and took over so many cities, so it seemed, we also had a managed care crisis. The end result of managed care, remember HMOs, is over 90% of inpatient treatment programs across this country closed. In other words, a drug showed up where people needed shelter and safety, and that safety was taken away through the closing of 90% of residential treatments across this country. So many communities of color, many African-American communities became like treatment deserts as it pertains to residential treatment. If you live in an African-American community, I invite you to think about How many inpatient programs are in your community? And if you tell me there are a few, I promise you that in most states, there are not more than 5 or 6 residential programs that have been around since 1986, most of them closed. And today we are dealing with an opioid epidemic, and that we know lots of young white suburban kids are dying and overdosing, but the problem still remains huge in African-American communities. Clearly, something different needs to occur. And Corey, we will go to the next slide. So we're going to talk about risk factors in African-American communities for substance use disorders, and then a return to drug use after you leave like treatment or the criminal justice system. But before we talk about risk factors, I think it's important, I'm a strengths-based social worker, to also talk about protective factors. What are those factors in African-American communities that protects members of the community from addiction, from mental illness? And I'll just give you a short list of protective factors. Extended family orientation. Knowing that a lot of people love you is a protective factor against mental illness and addiction. The patterns that we have to take in non-relatives. You know how when a kid is having trouble in their family, how their friend's family will take them in and they become like an extended family? That's a protective factor. Spirituality as a mental health and substance use disorders, protective factor for African Americans. And music. Where would we be? Where would African American people be without music? From blues to jazz, to Motown, to R&B, to hip hop. Music is medicine. Another protective factor is movement. Let me lean in and ask you this question. Have you noticed that every 3 months for the last 60 years, African Americans create a new dance? Have you noticed that? Every 3 months, a new dance. No one does that. It's genius. But I figured it out. There's a trauma specialist by the name of Bessel van der Kolk, and he wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. And what his research indicates is that when a person experiences trauma, the brain can forget the details of the trauma. The body has a way of remembering. That is why when you hug someone without their permission that has a history of trauma, sometimes their whole body will tense up. There's another book called My Grandmother's Hands, written by an African American, that tells the story of how trauma lodges itself in the body. And any kind of movement like dance can remove trauma from the body. And then another is that you've heard the expression that everything that does not kill you makes you stronger. So many African Americans have developed a certain amount of resilience as a result of dealing with hundreds of years of oppression. Let's talk about risk factors. We're going to look at 2 communities, metropolitan communities and rural communities. And Cora, we'll go to the next slide. So by definition, a metropolitan community is a city, a big city or small town with at least 2,500 residents, So let's take a moment to chat. Would you put in chat some metropolitan communities in the southern region of the United States? I'll start Atlanta. What are some other big cities? Now, we won't go there yet, Corey. We'll just stay right there for a moment. Let's see what they go. So someone said Charlotte. Okay, yep, that's huge. I've been there. Jackson, Mississippi, you bet. Jackson, Mississippi, Melanie, and Houston, Texas, yes. Maybe the 3rd or 4th largest city in the United States is in Houston, Texas, amongst the most diverse cities in the United States. Metropolitan cities, we're talking. How about Memphis, Tennessee? We got Memphis right there, Kimberly, one of my favorite places on the planet. Wilmington, Delaware, that's kind of west over there. Charleston, South Carolina, Emily, you bet, right? So let me, New York, New Jersey on the East Coast, let's add to the equation. And Corey, you'll go to the next slide. So we have like Inglewood, California, Watts, Inglewood in Chicago, Memphis we have over there in the corner, Cleveland, Ohio, Gary, Indiana, Harlem, Chicago, Flint, Michigan, Detroit. So let's chat. We won't go there yet, Corey. We'll stay there for a moment. When you think of a metropolitan city where African-Americans live, where there's lots of African-Americans, what kind of things come to your mind? When you think these cities, big cities where African-Americans live, give us some descriptions of what comes to your mind. We'll check it out in chat, Corey. So we got poverty, public housing, gangs. Somebody said good food, despair, high crime, over policing, liquor stores close by. This is interesting, right? All right, I'd like to add to you high crime, overcrowding. Yeah. Church and liquor stores, unhealthy food choices. Belonging. Yeah, so there's still sometimes this great sense of community. And Corey, we'll go to the next slide. I'll add to the list. So you see, when you think about metropolitan communities, we also think of, someone mentioned it earlier. Michael, hold on to the question, I will. I know it's not a simple question. Okay, so overcrowding. I don't know if you all knew this. Maybe you do. Between the 1940s to the 1970s, when African Americans made that great migration from the southern states to the northern states, in some cities like Chicago, right? They built like skyscrapers called public housing projects, the same in New York City, like Jay-Z and Nas grew up in Marcy projects in Brooklyn, right? These large public housing dwellings, right? And the purpose of like stacking people on top of each other in Chicago was to keep African Americans who had come from the southern states from spreading out into white neighborhoods. And the end result of that overcrowding was a lot of stress, gang activity, drug selling, high unemployment. Even in a good economy, the unemployment rate for African Americans is often twice that of like white communities. Easy access to drugs. Is it just me? I can tell you this is true in like Chicago and Detroit and Milwaukee, but is it just me? Is it just me? There's some large cities in the United States where you can get gun and drugs quicker than you can buy an apple or a pear or a peach. And I see a few nodding your head. So Michael, here are my thoughts. African Americans are individuals, community members who have a combination, who identify with their African origins, and they also are American citizens. Now, here's what I'm clear about, and we should honor diversity, and we should allow people to describe themselves or define themselves how they want to describe or define themselves. So there's some individuals who are of African origin, or who I might call African Americans, who they will say that I'm Black. So when I refer to them, when I will talk to them, I might say Black. Some will say they're African. Some will say African living in America. There's a lot of diversity there. But by my definition, an African American is someone who considers themselves African American, and they have both African origins, and they also are American citizens. Community violence, fear of being dead soon. Let me chat with you. I've traveled the country, and I've asked African American males, adolescent males. Thank you, Michael. I hope I did justice by that. African American males, teenagers and young adults. How long, at what age do most African American males live? How long do they live on average? Thank you, Michael. And what do you think is the most common answer they've given me? How long do African American men live? I'm talking, I've asked the question to 16, 17, 18-year-olds. Okay, so Kimberly says 25 and Keith says 35, 20 to 30, 21. Wyman, you hit it on the head. Wyman making, so I travel the country and I ask African American males, how long do most Black men live? And the most common answer I get is age 21. Let me tell you what they're telling me. The 18-year-olds are saying, I only have 3 years to live. The 19-year-olds are saying, I only have 2 years to live. Those who are 21 are saying to me, I might be dead this year. My first order of business is to convince them that you can live. Because the average life expectancy for African American males in my town, Chicago, is 70. And where you live, the average age is probably 74. Say, well, how come I have 3 friends die? 3 friends out of 1 million, right? You can live. And then the second thing is to give them reason to live. I work with young men who use drugs and they sell drugs. So I tell them these stories about this 16-year-old gang leader from my town who was in a shootout with a rival gang. And there was a gun to his head, and the other rival pulled the trigger twice, the gun jammed, no bullets came out. The 16-year-old gang leader saw that as a miracle from God. He did the unthinkable. He went and got a job at Burger King. Burger King. And those that followed him was laughing. Look at our chief working at Burger King. The owner of the Burger King saw something in him, nothing he imagined, that something that was really there, leadership. He says, if you give up this gang activity, I'll teach you everything there is to know about the fast food industry. And I read in Ebony magazine that this former gang member opened 100 Burger Kings and 57 Pizza Huts. So I shared it with the young men that I listen to, that I work with, to let them know it's possible. We can go to the next slide. Thank you, Corey. We're talking metropolitan communities, gangs and trauma, felony arrest. By the way, a felony arrest has a longer term consequence than having an addiction, because you can always get into recovery. That felony has a way of following you for a long time. Police brutality, gentrification, that's a lot of stress when you feel your neighborhood is being taken over, right? So I asked African Americans, how can you tell when your community is being taken over by another group? Corey, you go to the next slide if we could. They tell me the number one sign that our neighborhood is about to be gentrified is that they'll put a Starbucks in the neighborhood. That's how we know. Thank you, and we'll go to the next slide. Other risk factors for substance use and return to drug use for African Americans living in metropolitan communities, poorly performing schools, the have and the have-nots. We can go to the next slide, Corey. You see, in so many communities, like where I live, there are people who live in poverty that can see downtown. And knowing that you're in poverty and you see all that abundance and wealth, that alone can be traumatic. We'll go to the next slide if we can, Corey. Thank you. Poverty is a risk factor. You know, there was a time when Detroit, Michigan was the wealthiest city in the United States. There were many African Americans who left Little Rock, Arkansas, Memphis, Tennessee, right? And Atlanta, Georgia, headed to Detroit to work at GM, the wealthiest city in the world. Then what started happening is GM started shifting jobs abroad, out of the country, and many people lost their jobs. And the end result is, Corey, will go to the next slide. About 5 years ago, the city of Detroit filed for bankruptcy. Lots of unemployment. When you have lots of unemployment, my mentor, William White, said that whenever you have an economic recession, you can expect to either see a stimulant epidemic like crack or meth, or an opioid epidemic like heroin. Crack cocaine and heroin hit Detroit hard after those jobs went away. Gary, Indiana, there you go, Rotunda, you're absolutely correct. The steel mills in Gary went away and crack cocaine appeared. And we'll go to the next slide. Thank you, Corey. The city of Flint, Michigan. Did you know that there was a time when the city of Flint, Michigan was the wealthiest city in the world? You see, General Motors Corporation didn't begin in Detroit. It began in Flint. It moved to Detroit. Jobs went away in Flint. And then people started poisoning the water of people in Flint. Drug use increased. We'll go to the next slide. And thank you, Corey. So let's take a moment to talk about risk factors for substance use disorder and a return to drug use for African Americans leaving criminal justice system, leaving treatment in rural America. 20% of African Americans live in rural America. And often as it pertains to jobs, they're often the last hired and first fired. We've also learned that it's harder for African American farmers to get loans, lower union representation, higher unemployment rates, more arrests. We'll go to the next slide. Voter suppression. I think that's happening right now as we speak. I read that in certain cities, in certain small towns, that it takes African Americans twice as long to vote. Removing polls. Economic poverty. Kept out of unions, just Keith Murphy, correct? Invisibility. So sometimes individuals, African Americans living in rural America, will say that they often feel invisible. Northern gangs. Let's talk about that for a moment. The first time I ever visited Atlanta, Georgia, every Chicago street gang was in Atlanta, Georgia. They even got California gangs all over the South, Crips and Bloods. How'd that happen? It's called highways. There's a highway 65 that starts at Gary, Indiana, and goes all the way to Atlanta, and everybody has a cousin. There was a time that if you were African American in the mail, yes, Rotunda, correct, 65, Gary, There was a time when if you lost your mind in the North, they would send you to the South. Our first psychiatrists were the Southern states. Go home and spend time with your grandparents. Work on the farm. You don't need medicine, just go South. And eventually what we started doing when we would go South in the 70s and 80s, we would bring our great gang affiliation with us. I had a neighbor whose great grandparents were from Mississippi. They named a town after his great great grandfather. He was selling crack cocaine in Chicago, went to that little town where his grandfather's named after. Next thing you know, he's selling crack cocaine in that town. And we'll go to the next slide. Thank you, Corey. So let's talk about the healing force, the entire African-American community as the recovery center. I'm going to ask you a question. Feel free to chat. There are lots of groups that have migrated to the United States over the last 250 years. Which group that migrated to the United States achieved middle-class status the quickest? Who did it the quickest? What do you think? From poverty to middle class. Dr. Tiffany said Asians, the Irish, Italians, Jews and Italians. Let me answer the question. Nigerians do quite well here, don't they? High levels of college education, self-employment. Here's the answer. In the 1990s, Fidel Castro grew tired of the United States receiving Cubans from on US soils, Florida. So he emptied the prisons. He emptied the mental health centers in Cuba and sent all those who were incarcerated and all those receiving mental health treatment on ships to Florida. And Castro figured that once we received those who had mental illness and lives of crime, that we would never want to accept any more Cubans on US soil. The Coast Guard was at the ocean to greet the Cubans coming in. And Cuban families showed up. They were already living in Florida with blankets and clothes and told the Coast Guard to go home. We've got them. These families took them in. No mental health centers, no addiction treatment centers, no prisons. Families took them in. And they achieved middle-class status quicker than any other group that migrated to the United States. Where would African Americans be without the extended family? Where would I be without my grandmother? You know, I tell stories, so sometimes people stay at the end of this seminars, yes, and they tell stories. So a woman told me the following story, that she and her husband had a baby, and she asked her husband to go home to bring her some clean clothes so that she could wear clean clothes home from the hospital. She said her husband was gone for 2 days, and his sister showed up. She said when his sister showed up, she said that when her husband went home, there were men robbing the house. He went and got the family gun and held him at gunpoint and called the police. She said that when the police showed up and saw her husband holding the gun, the police didn't know if her husband was the good guy or the bad guy. So the police accidentally shot and killed her husband. She said she was to receive the largest settlement in Illinois history, wrongful death, police killing her husband. Said, Mark, I was in the courtroom and the judge opened his mouth and the judge said you were received. She said before the judge finished the sentence, there was a woman in the back of the courtroom who stood up and said, wait a minute, Your Honor. He's not her husband. I married the man first, we never divorced. The second woman, we can go back, Corey. The second woman received the settlement. Now, the woman who told me the story was a really good probation officer. I understand that before she got the news of betrayal from her husband, something like 35% of her caseload went back to prison. But after she got the news of betrayal, the numbers swelled from 35% going back to prison to 65%. Do you believe you can have some experiences that can affect your heart and affect your work? So one day she was at home bitter, and there was a ringing at her doorbell. She said there was a 13-year-old girl standing there. And the 13-year-old girl said, the woman who won the settlement is my mother, and the man who you married is my biological father. The girl told her right before her mother received the settlement check, the state came in, did a background check, found out her mother had been receiving public assistance illegally forever, a felony in all 50 states. They put her mother in prison. The girl said, when she out of prison, she neglected me. I've been going to school. I've been smoking marijuana. Can I live with you? Can I live with you? Looked at this little girl and said, You can live with me. Said, Mark, I mothered this girl. Love brought me back, and it brought her back too. She's not a college student. So any one of us can organize a healing forest. With Don Coyes, it started with 1, and then 2, 3, and 4. And we want to make sure in the African-American community, should we organize the whole community to work together for remote recovery? Families are at the table, and treatment centers, and faith-based organizations, churches. As a matter of fact, when crack cocaine hit African-American communities in the 1980s and treatment centers closed, faith-based organizations came to the table and organized. And people in recovery who went to those churches formed drug ministries to promote recovery. Other social service organizations like mental health facilities in African-American communities should be at the table. And persons in long-term recovery, that's important. To make sure that we have persons in long-term recovery at the table and the formerly incarcerated. You see, I'm convinced if all paid treatment centers went out of business tomorrow, that people in recovery would still be helping people with their recovery. Employers, people who have jobs. You see, they say that in African-American communities, on every corner is a church, a liquor store, and a barbecue restaurant. I never found that to be the case. Not a church on every corner. Think about if you live in an African-American community, not a bar on every corner, not a rib joint on every corner. Matter of fact, suburban communities where I do trainings have more fast food restaurants than Black communities. The truth is there are lots of African-American communities that are not creating a ton of jobs. You go to a party and ask a man who he is, he'll tell you what he does. What happens when jobs go away? Drug use increases. Employers need to be at the table. And anyone living in a community who's concerned about addictions and drug use in the community. And Corey, we'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So I want to give you some examples of healing forests in African-American communities. And we'll go to the next slide. So I want to start with the west side of Chicago, the economically poorest part of the city of Chicago, with the highest opioid overdose rate in the city, high unemployment, disproportionately African-American, the highest percentage of justice-involved individuals returned to 4 zip codes on the west side of the city of Chicago. So we'll go to the next slide. I want to share with you some of the things that they're doing on the west side of the city of Chicago, having created a healing forest. They have what's called the West Side Opioid Task Force, organized by State Representative LaShawn Ford. One man, one person, mobilized the entire West Side to work together to promote recovery. He has a meeting, one meeting once a month, attended by over 100 people. They actually have a work group that focuses on testing heroin for the presence of fentanyl. You know that fentanyl is 50 times more potent than heroin. It'll take you out. They have successfully reduced the overdose with death rates, working together on the west side of Chicago. They visited Canada and learned about safe injection sites that can be supervised and monitored. So ask me if I'm a fan of safe injection sites. Don't throw anything at me. I am. Especially if you can put a safe injection site. If nothing else, it'll do 3 things. It can reduce the risk of overdose death, hepatitis C, and HIV. And if I ruled the world, everywhere in the world where there's a safe injection site, there will be a treatment center nearby, recovery coaches in the area, right? So that those that we serve will have options. And we'll continue. We'll go to the next slide. Thank you, Corey. Yes, harm reduction. You are correct. So we're still talking about the west side of the city of Chicago. The use of Narcan distributed by recovery coaches all over the west side. Thousands of people are receiving, yes, also lowering crime rate, you're a bet. A partnership with 8 service providers, including Rush Hospital, where I was born. They're providing medications-assisted recovery, not indoors, but outside where people live. There's a program that provides some services on the west side of Chicago called the Night Ministry. And Cora, we go to the next slide. You all will like this. For 30 years, the Night Ministry has been ahead of its time. We're now talking about mobile recovery services. They've been doing this for 30 years. A bus shows up in economically challenged neighborhoods in Chicago, and on that bus, they have food and clothes and water and nurses and medicine and Narcan, all on the West Side. We'll go to the next slide. Also, as a part of the recovery revolution on the West Side of Chicago, is an organization called the National Alliance for the Empowerment of the Formerly Incarcerated, founded by Benneth Lee. And there's Benneth Lee right there on the screen. I'll share with you quickly his story. In 1986, the year crack cocaine showed up, and the year my father died smoking crack cocaine, I taught my first addictions course at a community college. And Benneth Lee was my first student. He was the first one to class. He sat in the front row, center aisle seat, and there were 40 students in the class. The other 39 students were either sitting up like this or leaning back. He was leaning forward, like he wanted the subject matter more than the other 39 students. So I became curious, why is he leaning forward? Why is he so hungry for this information? So I asked him to share his story. He went from death row, where he was on solitary confinement. He was about to be put to death for the one crime that he didn't commit. He was a gang leader from the west side of the city of Chicago, addicted to heroin. The one crime he didn't commit, he was on death row. I said, what was like solitary confinement like? I don't like to talk about solitary confinement. He said, minutes felt like hours, hours felt like days, days felt like weeks. He says, someone left a book in the cell when I was in solitary confinement, and I felt like I was going to lose my mind. So I decided I would read so I wouldn't lose my mind. But I hadn't read much. I dropped out of high school first semester freshman year. I picked up the book. And my plan, I tossed the book in the air, and whatever plate it landed on, whatever plate the book landed on, was where I was going to begin my reading. He said, I hoped it would land in the middle, because I figured, even though I had never read much, if something was juicy in the book, if it was interesting, it'd be in the middle. He tossed the book in the air. The book was called The Autobiography of Malcolm X. And the page it landed on was the page in that book where Malcolm X himself was incarcerated and could not read. Does anyone know how Malcolm X learned to read in prison? He learned to read in prison by reading the dictionary from cover to cover. To this day, there are young men and women walking around prisons all over the United States reading dictionaries because they heard that Malcolm X learned to read in prison, reading the dictionary from A to Z. So my buddy, my friend, my student, former student, Benneth Lee, asked for a dictionary. He learned to read well. The next thing he asked for was for a law book. I said, why a law book? He said, because I was facing death and my public defender was falling asleep during the trial. I wanted to figure out, how do you fire your public defender? He beat the case. He's been honored by 2 presidents of the United States as a person in long-term recovery that's making a difference. So he started this organization for African Americans turning from prison to the West Side. They do reentry circles, help with some recovery support, felony arrest expungement, employment support, recovery support. And we'll go to the next slide if we could, Corey. All happening in one neighborhood. There's a program in the neighborhood called CRCC, led by people in recovery. They train and hire recovery coaches. They have all recovery meetings, along with NA and AA, Narcan distribution all over the community. Services at Tent City. I bet you there's a lot of tent cities all over the country. Tent cities are places where people who are homeless live, and they have these tents, and they sleep next to each other in tents. So recovery coaches provide services in Tent City who work for CRCC. They have a prevention grant. It makes sense in African-American communities that we ought to be doing prevention and treatment simultaneously. Every year in September, National Recovery Month, they lead a recovery walk. They have something that's called Recovery Olympics. Yeah, they have lots going on while I'm in Portland, Oregon, you bet, right? Recovery Olympics, where people in recovery participate in sports for ribbons and trophies, et cetera. CRCC also operates as an RCO. And Corey, you'll go to the next slide. An RCO is a recovery community organization, an independent nonprofit organization led by persons in recovery. In order to be an RCO, at least 51% of your board has to be a person in recovery, along with their family members, friends, and allies. RCOs provide a combination of long-term peer-based recovery support, community education, grassroots mobilization and advocacy. Really important. RCO sits between treatment and peer support. They do advocacy. Treatment doesn't do advocacy. Advocacy is really important in African American communities. The sole mission of an RCO is to mobilize resources within the community and outside of the community to increase the prevalence and quality of long-term recovery within the community. And we will go to the next slide. Thank you, Corey. So also too, on the west side of Chicago, they provide some short-term treatment and medication-assisted recovery. It so happens, we go to the next slide, Corey, that there's a program on the west side of the city of Chicago called Above and Beyond. On the west side, the poorest part of the city, that received the NADAC award for the best program in the country in 2020. And when you walk into the program, the first thing you see is the decor and the waiting room. And Corey, we should go to the next slide. That's their waiting room. Have you seen a treatment center with a waiting room? We'll go back to that one. We'll go back to the one before. That one right there, that one. We'll stay there for a moment. Thank you. Have you seen a waiting room that looks like that and those tall ceilings? They said, we wanted to make sure that we had tall ceilings. Yeah, we want to make sure that we had tall ceilings. They invest in furniture so that it wouldn't look like a hospital. Many African Americans have really horrible experiences in hospitals. In some communities, the local hospital was known as the place where you go to die. That chandelier, it's like antelope horns. And one of their clients told me, I came in downtrodden and I had no hope. When I saw that chandelier with antelope horns, I felt like anything was possible. And Corey, we'll go to the next slide and we'll stay there for a moment. That's one of their waiting rooms. So they invest in their decor. When I saw their waiting room, I thought about something that Martin Luther King said, a term that Martin Luther King used, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. used. He says, don't ever let anybody feel like you're nobody. You have somebodyness. And their clients, when they visit that space, these economically poor clients, it helps them feel like I'm somebody. And we'll go to the next slide there, Corey. Thank you. So the program has music piping through the building so that when clients come in, they hear music, a range of different types of music. Music is good for the soul. They feed them 2 meals a day. A colleague of mine works in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and they work with clients who receive Medicare. Attendance was low. I said, Mark, how can we get our attendance low? Up, feed them. Feed them. Their receptionist, here's something else that's unique about the program. In addition to the decor and how the facility looks, leaving clients feeling like I'm somebody when I walk through the door, get this. Their receptionist has a master's degree in psychology, who's the best relationship builder in the program. And what the director told me is they wanted to make sure that the first person clients met with was someone who's clinical, who knows how to build relationships. So they invest a lot in their decor and the receptionist. When their clients show up, they provide some Southern hospitality. They give all their clients a tour. The bathroom is here. You can put your coat here, coffee over here, water over here, pop over there. They use a drop-in center model. You know why? Because lots of their clients struggle to keep up with appointments, so they allow them to drop in. They have interesting programming, movement therapy, dance therapy, theater, yoga, comedy, all those types of different programs. And you walk through the building, it's vibrant. So I know what you're thinking. Our program can't afford all that, some of you are thinking. And guess what they did? That program is funded by a millionaire. You know what our next frontier is? Our next frontier as a profession is to ask millionaires in long-term recovery, like Samuel L. Jackson and Whoopi Goldberg, et cetera, for funds to promote recovery within African-American communities. And Cora, we'll go to the next slide. So on the west side of Chicago, there's a politician, a US congressperson named Danny K. Davis. Danny K. Davis was the politician who put expungement legislation on the table in the US Congress. There's a program there called Thresholds. You will appreciate this. Thresholds is the largest freestanding, amongst the largest freestanding substance use disorders and co-occurring disorders programs in the country. They have a partnership with a police station on the west side of the city of Chicago. And every time someone gets arrested for a low-level drug-related offense, they have a choice: either go to court or work with a recovery coach from Thresholds. And all of them are choosing to work with a recovery coach. They have recovery homes on the west side, faith-based drug ministries, community revitalization. The mayor of Chicago is putting money in helping to revitalize the west side of Chicago. Medication-assisted recovery. You know, one of my favorite programs in the world? We have in our town a program where these women travel to Memphis, from Chicago to Memphis, to learn how to become certified doulas. And you know, doulas are paraprofessionals that help women with their delivery. These certified doulas, who also certified as certified recovery coaches, are helping women, disproportionately African-American women in Chicago, with their delivery of their babies, and saying at the same time, and guess what? To these women who are opiate addicted, I can also provide recovery support for you after your baby is born. Harm reduction on the west side of Chicago. And Corey, we'll go to the next slide. So let's take a moment to talk about what's in Detroit. If you get a chance, you should Google Detroit Recovery Project. Their executive director is Andre Johnson. And they've anchored recovery throughout the city of Detroit. There's a partnership between the city of Detroit and the whole entire state of Michigan. They've hired tons of recovery coaching, ongoing recovery support anchored in African-American communities, sober sports and recreation, recovery housing. And they too are a recovery community organization advocating for African-Americans seeking recovery within the criminal justice system, within the court system, with child welfare systems, et cetera. This is the wave of the future. We'll go to the next slide, Corey. In Gary, Indiana, there was a program called Miracle Village, one of the best programs I've ever seen, in public housing in Gary, Indiana, 4 adjacent row houses. They hired recovery coaches, women in recovery, to walk through public housing in Gary and recruit women to go through recovery, to go through Miracle Village recovery program. Now I want you to visualize 4 row houses adjacent to each other, which constitutes Miracle Village. This row house is the recovery center. The next row house is the mental health facility. Why is that important? Because lots of the women receiving services have traumatic stress disorders, which they medicate with drugs and various types of mental illness. Next to the mental health facility is a child care facility. You know, one of the main reasons that women can't go to treatment is who's going to take care of the babies. Yep, I know that, Rotunda. Rotunda, you must be from Gary, Indiana. Are you there now? And also next to the child care center, yes, very good. Next to the child care center, right? Right next to the child care center, there was a medical clinic. Because as you know, lots of individuals with addictions tend to ignore their medical health. They've actually brought these services to public housing. That's the wave of the future. We shall go to the next slide if we can. So let's talk a bit about other types of healing force, criminal justice. Inside of prisons in some states, they have what's called inner circle. We'll go back. They have what's called the inner circle. And on the inside, these men who are incarcerated provide support to each other while they're incarcerated. And then when they go back to their community, they can transition from inner circle inside of prisons to winner circle in the community. Why is that important? Okay, Corey, thank you. And why is that important? It's important because, you know, lots of individuals will leave prison and they go back to their community. They're uncomfortable, even in traditional 12-step group meetings like AA and NA, talking about their criminal past and talking about things like, I was incarcerated for 10 years. When I went to prison, my son was 4 years old. Now he's 14. He doesn't recognize me. He doesn't respect me. You're going to mention it in AA? No, but you mentioned it at Winter Circle with a group of others who spent time in the criminal justice system who understand. In my town, this is a wonderful program. In East St. Louis, Illinois, the southern tip of Illinois, they have a prison called Southwestern Correctional Center. Or in that prison, men who are incarcerated can take courses to become recovery coaches while they're incarcerated. I want you to think about that for a moment. while they're incarcerated, they can take courses to become recovery coaches. And when they return to Chicago from prison, there's a program in Chicago that has agreed to hire all of them when they return. A partnership between a community and a prison in the southern tip of Illinois. These men leave prison gainfully employed as recovery coaches. They have the lowest recidivism rate in the state. Corey, we'll go to the next slide. Thank you for helping me. You know, when crack cocaine had a stronghold on African-American communities, every denomination of church formed church-based drug ministries, the most famous of which is Glide Memorial Church in San Francisco. On any given Sunday, 2,000 people show up for a special church service. 1,600 of them are in recovery. Think about that. 2,000 people, 1,600 in recovery. They do lots of rallies in the African-American community without anonymity. You know the reason Alcoholics Anonymous started off as anonymous? Because the original members of Alcoholics Anonymous started in 1935 were empowered white males who had reputations to protect. The first two members of Alcoholics Anonymous was a surgeon and a stockbroker. The third member was a lawyer. In Glide Church, they use first and last names because they say in order to help our community to recover, we need to be visible. They need to see our faces and know our names. That church, the last time I read the book, there's a book by Pastor Cecil Williams called No Hiding Place, and it's about Glide Memorial Church's recovery program. There were 16 generations working on a different level of growth. You know, that's consistent with African-American families that have these sort of multi-generations within the family, special programming for men and women. That's Glide Church. And Corey, we should go to the next slide. Thank you. So it's really important in African-American communities to honor multiple pathways of recovery. People often whisper that Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous are not popular amongst African Americans. Nothing can be further from the truth. 12-step recovery is really big in African American communities. There's a pathway of recovery called solo recovery, faith-based recovery, medication-assisted recovery, nutrition, recovery home living, working with recovery coaches. Just like in the forest, there are different types of plants and flowers and trees. In African American communities, it's important to honor a range of different types, ways in which people celebrate their recovery and ways in which they get into recovery. And the next thought on that slide, it's important, we'll go back. Yeah, we'll stay there, Corey, thank you. It's really important for us to begin to create our own sober holidays, and we'll go to the next slide. So I have for us some recommendations. Drug-free holidays. We'll stay there for a moment, Corey. Can you think of any celebrations anywhere in America that doesn't have alcohol and drugs included? New Year's, Christmas. They created a holiday the day before Thanksgiving is the heaviest drinking day all 365 days a year. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving, more automobile crashes happen on the day. We even created a holiday called National Weed Day, April 20th. In fact, I told a group of African-American youth I wanted to mess up their high, that April 20th also happens to be Hitler's birthday. Doesn't that make you not want to smoke marijuana? No, of course not. We invent these holidays to get high. So it's also possible to create sober holidays. So I have a list for you and encourage you to think about creating these and working with your clients. Okay, so the first one would be New Year's Day. We encourage our clients to have a day of gratitude for another year of recovery, surrounded by others in recovery, as opposed to using champagne. Corey, we should go to the next slide. How about Muhammad Ali Day? Wouldn't that be an excellent holiday to celebrate his courage and his love of the African-American community? We'll go to the next slide, Corey. How about Afena Shakur Day? We'll stay on this slide for a moment. Afena Shakur was the mother of slain rapper Tupac Shakur. And after he was assassinated, she was visited by an actress by the name of Jada Pinkett Smith. And she was really good friends with Tupac. In fact, he was in love with her. And they went to high school together, he and Jada, the School of the Performing Arts in Baltimore, Maryland. He proposed to her and said, I can't marry you, Tupac. You smoke too much weed. I'm marrying the Fresh Prince. Well, right before he died, his mother, Afena Shakur, got into recovery And she was visited by Jada Pinkett and a woman named Jasmine Guy from a sitcom called Another World, a different world, I think. And Jada told Afeni Shakur, cry for 3 days and get a lawyer. Your son Tupac got high a lot. He left a lot of money on the table. This story could be called, Why Would a Former Black Panther? Afeni Shakur was a Black Panther. Why would she have an American flag in her front yard when she moved to Georgia? Well, she got an accountant and a lawyer to recoup Tupac's money that he left on the table as royalties. And September 11, 2001, his accountant, who worked in the World Trade Towers, made it outside of the building. But he remembered that he left all of Tupac's paperwork on his desk. So the accountant went back in the World Trade Towers. He never came out. So his mother, Afeni Shakur, she kept a flag in her front yard, and in recovery, her birthday is January 8th. She founded the Tupac Shakur Foundation and the Tupac Shakur Center for Performing Arts in Stone Mountain, Georgia. How about celebrating her birthday as a holiday? And we'll go to the next slide if we could, Corey. How about Dr. Martin Luther King Day, the courageous one? People in recovery can take this as a day of advocacy for something that they deeply believe in. And Corey, we'll go to the next slide if we can. You know, African American History Month offers multiple opportunities to celebrate. How about Rosa Parks' birthday, February 4th, or Hank Aaron Day, the Atlanta Brave, Frederick Douglass Day? Did you know? Are you sitting down? Did you know that Frederick Douglass' birthday, believed to be Valentine's Day, that Frederick Douglass was the first prominent American recovering alcoholic? Did you know he was in recovery? He was in recovery, and his famous quote is that we can't stagger to freedom. You see, he was traumatized in slavery, and so he had nightmares, and so he drank alcohol in order to deal with the nightmares. But he believed that alcohol was used to control the slaves. He said they would whip us Monday through Friday and then allow us to drink alcohol on Saturday. And once we tasted liquor, we would never want to escape. Think about it. There are African-American men who stay non-drug free, alcohol free, Sunday through Thursday, and drink on Fridays and Saturdays. Frederick Douglass says it goes all the way back to that period during slavery. So he was one of the founders of the Black temperance movement. So how about celebrating his birthday? We'll go to the next one as a part of a healing forest. The calendar year offers almost endless opportunities to create holidays that honor the legacies of African Americans maintaining recovery. We should go to the next slide, Corey, thank you. Malcolm X Day, another person in recovery, like Frederick Douglass. Advocacy was an important part of his recovery. May 19th is a celebration, another day to be sober. Go to the next slide if we can. Madam C.J. Walker, the first self-made American woman millionaire. That can be a day where we can sort of think about our dreams or think about starting a business in recovery. And we'll go to the next slide. Harriet Tubman Day, the courageous one. We'll celebrate. We don't really know her birthday. She was born into slavery. Pick a day. We'll go to the next slide, Corey. Paul Robeson Day, Ida B. Wells Day, your own birthday. See, when we start to celebrate these holidays, we start to transform culture, right? And we'll go to the next slide. Okay. How many of you are aware of the woman on the right, Dr. Mae Jemison? She was the first African-American astronaut from my town, Chicago public school graduate. I worked with her father. He was a janitor where I worked as a social worker. How did his daughter get to outer space? He said every night we would let her watch her favorite program on television, Star Trek. And she wanted to be Uhura. Is that how you pronounce her name? The woman from Star Trek? Uhura. She found out years later she wanted to be Uhura when she met Uhura. Uhura wanted to quit Star Trek because Captain Kirk and Dr. Spock had all the speaking lines. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. went to Uhura and said, don't quit. There are young Black girls watching you who want to be you one day. And one of them was Dr. Mae Jemison. Her father told me that she was so busy dreaming about the possibilities that she didn't have time to get high. How long do we celebrate her birthday? All right, let's take a moment there, Corey, and see if there are any questions. Feel free to put your question in chat. And Corey, can people also unmute themselves?
Yes, they should be able to unmute themselves.
Yeah, so let's see what your questions or comments are. You're gonna mute yourself and put it in chat. Sometimes people are a little nervous to ask the first question. Let's hear the second question. Who has a question? Thank you, Rotunda. Gary, Indiana's in the house.
Yes.
That's right. Who has a question or comment? Mute yourself and put it in chat. This is the question you're going to wish you had a chance to ask before we sign out. Thank you, Abina. Let me ask you. Okay, thank you, Alfredo. All right, so now there are 23 million people in the United States who say they're in recovery. 23 million. And only 2 million are in 12-step recovery. So we ought to ask ourselves, how are the other 21 million people? We'll go back for a moment.
I'm sorry about
slide
that.
before. That's okay. We ought to ask ourselves, how are the other 21 million getting into recovery? As much as you and I would like everybody to be drug-free right away, everybody's not going to do it. So I'm a fan of helping people stay alive. Again, as Dr. Tonier Kane said, as long as there's breath, there's hope. So I'm a fan of harm reduction. I wasn't a fan of anything but like total abstinence 25 years ago, but now I'm learning more and more about how people are resolving a substance use disorder. So I am a fan of harm reduction. I'm a fan of safe injection sites because you're not sharing needles. So then there's medical supervision, so you're not going to overdose there. You're less likely to get HIV and hepatitis C. If I ruled the world, as I said, I put a safe injection site right next to a treatment center. You know, in a little city in Indiana, jobs went away. In a town of 4,000 people, 400 people became HIV positive. They were sharing needles. And one man pulled the community together. One man, it takes one person to help pull a community together. And they had a safe place, a needle exchange, syringe exchange. And they went from 140 people being diagnosed with HIV in 1 year, and 2 years later, just 8 people. So I'm a fan of people not sharing needles. Anyone else have a question or a comment? Because I want to share something with you. Corey, you'll go to the next slide.
Yes, sir. And I think you have a question here from Michael Hill.
Thank you, Michael.
A healing force for the African American members in a primarily white community.
Yeah, so just like women go to AA and NA, and when they're outnumbered, sometimes they form all women's groups, a group within a group. So Michael, I think it's possible to form a group within a group. I do. And in forming a group within a group, you can also include the extended family. And thanks for virtual communication, they can connect with African Americans and other communities all over the world. So I think it's possible. Let's say if we know the why, we can get past anyhow. So I am the curator of the online museum of African Americans Addiction Treatment and Recovery. And the link is right here. I invite you to visit. We have a ton of stuff, lots of music and song, articles, podcasts. What I'm most proud of is that we have webinars, about 15 webinars that talks about various aspects of helping African Americans with their recovery. And what I've learned over the years is much less about anything I teach, but it's more about the action you take. So let's chat one more time. I want to ask you to put in chat, what's the one action you're going to take when this webinar is over as a result of the time that we spent together today? Thank you, Michael. What's the action you're going to take as a result of us spending the time together? That way we know whether or not our time together was valuable. What's the action? And Corey, let me see if you see any responses in chat about those actions. I'm going to share one more story and then they can go to the survey. What's the action?
Treatment holidays. From
Okay,
Chantel.
and when you do that, Chantel, let us know what you created. I'd be really interested to know. Holidays are a part of culture. Treatment and recovery, Wendy. Continue with the men's wellness group, Wyman said. Wyman Macon. Okay, so here's the story. Look for more programs in Gary. If you get a chance, Rotana, you should send me an email because there's some work that we want to do in Gary, Indiana. We're right next door. If Gary, Indiana sneezes, Chicago says, God bless you.
What about South Bend?
I'm just a step away from South Bend. There's some stuff we want to do for sure.
Well, that's where I'm from, Wyman.
All right, so imagine that many of you are familiar with a painting called The Praying Hands. It looks like praying hands. The painting The Praying Hands was painted by a man by the name of Albrecht Dürer during the 15th century in Germany. From the time he was a little boy, he always wanted to be an artist. So did his brother Albert. The problem was they were really poor. They had 18 siblings. Any of you all have 18 siblings? I don't even know if people can make 18 babies anymore. They were really poor. So the two brothers decided they would flip a coin, and whoever lost the coin toss would go and work in the coal mines to send the other one to art school, and then upon graduation, they would switch roles. And Albert won the coin toss, and he went to a famous art school in Nuremberg, Germany. He distinguished himself as the greatest artist in all of Germany the 4 years he was in college. So upon graduation, he returned to the small town and they held a dinner for him. And everyone was praising him on his incredible artistic talent, especially his father. He looked at his father and said, Dad, instead of praising me, you ought to praise my brother Albert. He was the one who went and worked in the coal mines to send me to art school. He looked over at Albert and said, Albert, now that I've gone to art school, it's your turn. I'll go and work in the coal mines to pay for your education. Tears welled up in Albert's eyes and he held his hands up and he said, my dear brother, while you were away in art school, every bone in both of my hands were crushed from having worked in the coal mines. In addition to that, he said, I got a case of arthritis so bad last year in my hands working in the coal mines, I could barely lift this fork to eat, let alone operate a paintbrush. He said, no, my brother, I won't be going to art school. And Albert took a good look at his brother's hands and he painted his brother's hands. And those are the hands behind the painting of The Praying Hands. The next time you look at the painting, lean in close and you'll notice lots of scratches, scrapes, and bruises on these hands. These are imperfect hands. But of course, he got those working in the coal mines as well. What it said to me is that behind every success, there are people behind the scenes who rarely get credit. And as it pertains to recovery, you are the people behind the scenes making all the difference in the world. The world can't compensate you enough for the work that you do. Thank you for all that you do. And thank you for spending time with me.